Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to another session of Karwan Online History Festival Season 2. I am Ishan Sharma and today I am joined by an eminent archaeologist, Professor Vasant Shinde sir, and today he'll be delivering a lecture on new approaches to history writing. Before beginning, I would like to give a small introduction of our speaker, though he doesn't need an introduction. Professor Shinde is an internationally renowned archaeologist, former Vice Chancellor of the Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute, Deemed University, Pune. He is currently working as Director General of Maritime Heritage Complex, Gandhinagar. Professor Shinde has been a pioneer in archaeological research in the last 35 plus years, specializing in the archaeological proto-history of South Asia as well as field archaeology. He has completed 16 major research projects, the process of which he has collaborated with scholars and institutes from all across the world. Sorry. He has also directed a vast number of excavations around the country, from Harappan sites in Gujarat and Haryana to Chalcolithic sites in Madhya Pradesh and in the Deccan, to proto-historic and early historic sites in Rajasthan and Maharashtra. Presently, he has been directing a very prestigious research project at the largest Harappan site of Rakhigadi in Haryana. So, welcome, sir. It's an honor to have you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ishan. I'm extremely happy to be here again. I hope that all of you are fine. Now, what I decided today that I want to talk face to face, and therefore I am not showing any slides today. And I'm going to discuss the basic issues in the reconstruction of history and what should be the new approach. Because I have realized that history is becoming a little bored, right? Because same things are being repeated. The history which I learned when I was a student, the same history I taught to my students, and my students in fact are teaching the same history. So it is not becoming very attractive field in fact, and it is up to us how to make this attractive. Now people have a lot of misunderstanding as to why subjects like history should be taught. In fact, I can give you an example. Technical college, of course, all of you know very well. This is the maybe the Makkah of the archaeology in the country, and Professor S.D. Sanklia, he developed this department, with great efforts. He had a great team, and one day he had invited one very prominent politician to visit the institute, and he saw the institute. Professor Sanklia showed him, and before leaving, he said that why should we support subjects like archaeology, history, because it is not really generating any revenue for the country. On the other hand, government is spending on these subjects, the West, which is West, as he said. So this is the level of understanding, and therefore, perhaps we are responsible to some extent because we have to convey to the masses the importance of the subject and how relevant it is. And its relevance is very important. Relevance to the contemporary society and what things we learn from history, that should be highlighted, and we need to really adopt these things, and then only perhaps people will understand the importance of history. So that is one misunderstanding. But also among the students, they don't know what approach one should follow for maybe research, for maybe reconstructing the past. And I'm going to highlight some of the important approaches that perhaps we should follow from here onward. And by doing so, perhaps we will make history, archaeology very popular and very relevant, in fact, to the present society. So this is what I feel, and therefore I have chosen this topic, and I have chosen to speak face to face to with all of you. Now, when the history writing, systematic history writing started in the country. And that happened, in fact, after the establishment of the Asiatic Society in Bengal. That was way back in 1784. And William Jones, the administrator of the East India Company, he was responsible for the establishment of the Asiatic Society. Now, what is the greatness of this particular man, and what one should learn from this? When he came here, he realized that unless you understand the culture of the people, unless you understand the language of the people, perhaps you will not be able to effectively administer these people. And therefore, he decided to learn, Sanskrit. And through Sanskrit, of course, he could try to highlight some of the important traditions of the country. And then, at one stage, he became Sanskrit Pandit also. So this is how, one should really, uh, adopt, this type of approach. So this is the approach that he adopted. And he realized that, to writing the history of this country, there should be a proper organization. And that is how the Asiatic Society was established by him. So that is the beginning of this. But then, there was a very important approach which was adopted by one Alexander Cunningham. That was in maybe in 1930s, 40s. And that approach was very important. Perhaps, according to me, that is the most systematic approach for the collection of data which he showed to us. And of course, you must have heard the name of Alexander Cunningham. He became the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1863. What he did, in fact, very important. So he made a list, he studied the literature, the textual data that we have. He studied, all, ancient literature, most of the ancient literature. Also, he studied the foreign travelers' account left behind by mostly the Chinese and the Megasthenes in his Indica. And then, he made a list, because in this text, there is a mention about different sites, different places of importance. So he made a list of, the sites. And then, actually he made efforts to discover, sites in the eastern part of the country, particularly in Bihar and Bengal region. So by doing so, for the first time, he showed how one can discover ancient sites. Because sites are very important, because most of our data, the data that we use for writing history, comes from the archaeological site. An archaeological site can be defined as a place where we find traces of human activities. So discovering site is very, very important. And he showed us the way. And he discovered a number of Buddhist sites, in the eastern part of the country. Then after him, the first Indian scholar to adopt this particular approach was Professor B.B. Lal. All of you must have heard his name because his name is always, uh, you know, always found in fact in the Ayodhya issue. But he initiated this Ayodhya project, rather project on Mahabharata in 1950s. And what he did, very very important. But he followed the approach which was suggested by Alexander Cunningham. So he also made, in our epics, particularly Mahabharata, there is a mention of maybe important sites like, the Aichatra is mentioned, Hastinapur is mentioned, Ayodhya is mentioned, and Indraprasth. All the sites are mentioned. So on the basis of the locations given, he tried to locate the sites. He located the sites. So for example, he identified the the old, sorry, the Purana Kila area of Delhi as Indraprasth, and that is the right uh, you know uh, identification that he did. Then of course he identified Hastinapur, Ayodhya, and Aichatra also. So that is what he did in fact. The approach which was shown by Alexander Cunningham was followed by him. But then he went one stage further. He carried out excavations at all the sites. In fact, he excavated Indraprasth, Hastinapur, and Ayodhya. And one Ken Dixit, in fact, Rao Bahadur Ken Dixit, he excavated the site of Aichatra. So all the four sites were excavated because he was interested, Professor B.B. Lal, to find out the traces of Mahabharat culture, Mahabharat period. So what he found, in fact, at all the sites, he found one culture common at all the four sites. The other cultures were not really common at all the sites. So one culture that was found was what we call as PGW culture, painted grey ware culture, and that is a culture which represents the initial stage of the Iron Age in North India. That is dated between 1200 to 700, 600 BC. So he thought initially, since at all the sites this particular cultural phase was found, he thought this is the culture representing Mahabharat period. But then, later, in fact, there was a lot of criticism because the data that was obtained from the painted graver level was not matching with the data from the textual data, the description given in the text. And in the text, of course, there is mention of maybe big cities, mention of big iron implements, etc., swords and all this, even chariots and all this. So he did not find the evidence of cities and towns or the traces of cities and towns at all the sites. On the other hand, the culture that was found by him, the painted gravet, it was very poor because it is the culture of the beginning of the Iron Age, and these people were living in small circular huts. They just began to introduce iron technology in the country, and very small amount of iron tools were found, maybe small tools were found. So later, he had to change, but he said that perhaps this is not the culture which can represent Mahabharata period. But the approach that he showed is very important. And unfortunately, these type of approaches are not really followed rigorously by scholars, in fact, in the field of history and archaeology. But then, the most important breakthrough came in 1980s. All of you know, or you have heard the name of Professor R. S. Sharma, Ram Sharan Sharma. And he was from Delhi University. In fact, he was professor of history in Delhi University. And he initiated a very, very important research methodology in the country, which is unfortunately not followed by most of us, most of the scholars in the country. So what it did, in fact, for the first time, he synthesized the textual evidence and the archaeological evidence. One misunderstanding among the people is that archaeologists deal only with that period for which there is no written record. But that is not true. In fact, archaeologists also deal with the historical period, with the medieval, maybe period also, and with the modern period also. So we have prehistoric, maybe archaeology, we have protohistoric archaeology, we have historical archaeology, we have medieval archaeology, and we have industrial archaeology also, and ethnoarchaeology, in which we study the modern communities. So it is not that we confine ourselves. I, being an archaeologist, I am explaining this to you. We are not really confining ourselves to only those periods for which there is no written records. But historians and archaeologists, if they come together, then perhaps we will be able to generate the entire or reconstruct the entire history. And our history starts from almost 2 million years, almost 20 lakh years ago, our history starts. The earliest stone tool found in the Indian subcontinent is dated to around 2 million years. And there are, of course, there are some sites in northwest in Pakistan. There are some sites in central India, on the border of Karnataka and Maharashtra. And there are a couple of sites in Tamil Nadu, where we have found quite early dates for the beginning of the Stone Age. So from Stone Age till maybe the early strike period, you know, we do not have written records properly. Even though in the Harappan period, we have the maybe evidence of the written records, but we have not been able to decipher the writing system of the Harappans. So we are not really able to use that data for writing history. But then the real record starts, the written records starts from 4th century BC. So prior to 4th century BC, there is a very lengthy period, and archaeologists, by collecting data, in fact, they try to reconstruct the history. But then, for the period for which there is written records, the archaeologists and historians can come together. Now, the history that is written on merely textual data is always misleading, because firstly, we have a lot of problems about the dating of the early text. For example, the Vedic text, we do not know exactly what is the period of the Vedic period. Then when these records were written, we do not really know. Well, we have no way to understand or to date these records. And therefore, even though there is a lot of information, we are not really able to use that information for writing history. The other problem, which is more serious, is that these written records are created on behalf of some rulers, maybe on behalf of kings or queens, and they will not really write anything which goes contrary or against their rule. So they will not mention, in fact, the patchy or the gray periods of their rule. They only will always exaggerate, the history of that particular period. So we do get the exaggerated history of that particular period. And thirdly, they do not really reveal the lifestyle of the common people. So we don't really understand, we don't really have any way to understand the history of the common people. And therefore, the written records are considered to be heavily biased. And therefore, here, we have to take help. This is what R.A. Sharma had suggested. We have to take help of the actual, data, surviving data, and that data is being studied, collected by archaeologists. So he proposed that, the archaeologists and historians need to work together to bring out or to reconstruct the true history of the country. And he gave the example. In fact, he worked on the Gupta age. I'm sure that some of you know about this. So all of us know, of course, in the ancient Indian history, the Gupta age is considered to be the golden age. And this golden period is, rather described on the basis of only written records. Because, we have, there was a tremendous development, of course, in art and literature at that time. Then, there is a mention about, about the area that was conquered by Samudragupta. In fact, Prayak Prasasti has given a full account of the area that was conquered by Samudragupta. Almost the entire, Indian subcontinent was under his rule. Then also Samudragupta also issued golden coins. So on the basis of these, the history of that particular period was written on the basis of these accounts. And these accounts give very flowery picture of that particular period. So historians thought that this is really, this reveals or reflects the golden age in the ancient Indian period. But then R.S. Sharma decided to consider or study the actual archaeological data coming from number of sites in North India, because the main core part of the Gupta period of the Gupta dynasty was in North India. And archaeologists have excavated, they have discovered number of sites of the early historic period. And here, he compared two periods. One is the Kushan period, which is earlier than Gupta, and the Gupta period. And one by one, in fact, we started, you know, uh, understand. He wanted to understand, the density of the settlements. Yeah, because we have discovered number of sites, and he noticed that the there are large number of Kushan sites in North India. Compared to that, the number of the Gupta period site is very small. Hardly maybe handful of sites are there. That is one. In fact, he began to ask questions. Is this a sign of a golden age? If it was a golden age, that should have reflected in large number of sites, which is not there. So that was one, very important analysis that he did. Then what he did, what he found out that wherever there is Kushan level, on top of that, the Gupta people have established their settlement. So there are a number of sites where we find maybe presence of multicultures. So there are very few pure Gupta sites, but there are a large number of sites where they are located on top of the Kushan levels. Thirdly, what we notice, because we have excavated some sites, the structures and the data from the Kushan period is very, very prosperous. Kushan people, firstly they created the building material, the bricks, burnt bricks, and number of the components related to the building activities. The houses are very large and spacious and very well built structures. Similarly, there's a profusion in fact in other material culture like in jewelry, in tools, and other objects. He realized that the structures from the Gupta period are not that big. In fact, they're smaller compared to the Kushan structures. They're not nicely or well built. Thirdly, he noticed that the Gupta people have not really created their own building material. What they did, in fact, they knew that there are some structures of the earlier phase, earlier period. So they dug, in the lower levels, and they took out the bricks of the surviving walls of the Kushan structures. And they used that material for constructing their own structures. So that is one very, very interesting evidence that he has compared. And then of course the number of artifacts found, again they are very small in number compared to the Kushan levels. So here also he said that this is not reflecting the golden age. And therefore, he came to the conclusion that Gupta period was not the golden age in ancient Indian history. If at all it was, any period that needs to be considered as golden age, he says that Kushan period can be considered as golden age because that has all the characteristic feature of the golden age, which is not there in fact in the Gupta period sites. So here, in fact, he proposed, he did reconstruction of the Gupta period, which was contrary to what is taught, in fact, and what is done by historians. Because the historians, when they reconstruct the history of the Gupta period, they have used only one source. That is not really enough. And this is how, if you really want to understand the actual, the condition during any particular period, then you need to consider all the possible different sources available. And that is what, he did that. We may not agree. Some of the scholars do not agree that, the conclusions that he has drawn, maybe, they're erroneous, some say. That is not important here. What is important here that he has shown us a way, and we are not really following that particular way. In fact, we tried. In fact, only place in India where these type of approaches are followed is Deccan College in Pune. And we did, in fact, no, I excavated on site, Satwan site near Pune, the place called Junnar. Very important, very strategic site. That was the first capital of of the Satvans. And again, before the excavation of the site of Junnar, the reconstructed history of the Satwan revealed that it was very flourishing state. But we actually excavated the area where common people were living, and that has given us completely different picture. Like today, in fact, people living in the village have a different lifestyle, different maybe economic condition compared to the people living in the city. So same thing was happening in fact in the past also. Even though there was urbanization, it is not that every person was living in the city or town. Large number of population was living in the villages also. And we have excavated these villages. These are the places which were occupied by the common people. And therefore, we have found different evidence. And that evidence now we try to synthesize and put together. So this is how, this is how, one needs to undertake different approach for writing history. If you adopt this approach, I'm sure that we will be able to provide a proper or the true history of the ancient period. That is the need of the hour. And if you do that, the history, I'm sure that history is going to be very, very challenging and very, very interesting. So we have to make this, really exercise very interesting. Uh, in archaeology, there are two terms used. One is called traditional archaeology. The archaeology which was followed before 1960 is considered to be traditional archaeology. And then, of course, some new developments happened. And then, after 1960, some new approaches were introduced, and that is called new archaeology or post-processual archaeology. I will explain what is the difference between the traditional archaeology and new archaeology. Now, new archaeology was propounded by two eminent scholars, and fortunately, I worked with both of these scholars. One is the Louis Binford from US. In fact, he visited Deccan College, and we had very good interaction discussion. What he did, in fact, he wrote a paper called Analytical Archaeology in 1962-63. And he told us, when he visited our university, that the first draft that he produced, he gave that draft to his students to read. And after a few days, his students came back to him and they said that, can you interpret this in English language? The paper was written in English, but it was written in such a way, in such a jargon language, that his students were not able to understand a word of that. So that is a drawback, in fact. Now, if you really want to understand new archaeology, you will have to read at least 5 to 6 times the same article, and then only perhaps you will be able to understand the meaning of that particular writing. But once you understand that, it is really very important. You get the proper direction for your research. So that is very important. So that was one first article, which is considered to be, path-breaking article. So on the other hand, one, Ian Hodder in Cambridge University. He was in Cambridge University at that time when I visited Cambridge University and worked with him. But now, of course, he's working at Stanford University in US. So he published, models in archaeology. In fact, there was one David Clark before this Ian Hodder. And David Clark published this Models in Archaeology, and there he proposed new approaches to the subject. So here both, in fact, Winford, David Clark, and Ian Hodder. This David Clark and Ian Hodder have worked together, and they have proposed approaches which are very important. Now, in traditional archaeology, what we do, we reconstruct the events. Now, and there we ask questions like what happened in the past. So those events, once we start asking questions like what happened, then we start narrating. This is what happened. So we only try to reconstruct the events in the past here. And that is what is happening. In fact, if you read the writings of the Indian scholars, you'll find only the reconstruction of the events, both historians and archaeologists. But then new archaeology said that that is not enough, in fact. You need to ask questions like why it happened. And then, you start explaining. You follow the analytical approach. You follow maybe, explanatory approach, etc., which was not there, in fact, in earlier. It's very simple, but so effective, New archaeology approach is so effective that once you start asking a question like why it happened, then it leads to a number of sub questions, and then it leads you to the logical conclusion ultimately. Just to give example, in the Harappan period, we are getting a lot of maybe copper objects, a lot of beads of semi-precious stone. So we, on one hand, we say that these are the objects found in the excavation, and then on the other hand, how these objects have come here. Then we start asking questions: is raw material available nearby? If not, from where this raw materials come? So then we start asking questions like rather we try to find out their links, trade links with different regions. And then, of course, it ultimately leads us to maybe to West Asia. In some Mesopotamian sites, we find beads of carnelian, semi-precious stone, and definitely we know that this carnelian is found only in the Indian subcontinent. They were made by the Harappans and supplied by the Harappans to them. So that is how ultimately we reach to the we maybe conclude that Harappans had trade links with the Mesopotamians. And then we try to find out how this link was established. What could be the means of communication? So these are the questions which lead to different maybe sub questions. That does not happen in fact in the traditional archaeology. In traditional archaeology, we just describe the beats and forget. So this is a very important approach. That that was introduced by the new archaeologists. So, and the second thing that the new archaeologists suggested, which is so important, that take a help of other sciences. You can take help of social sciences, other social sciences. You can take help of natural sciences, take help of environmental sciences, health sciences, etc. There is not no any science which is not really useful in archaeology. Every science that is available, even mathematics also is useful. So they suggested that you take help of these sciences for the maybe for the analysis of the data, and that analysis will provide you ultimately sufficient evidence, in fact, for the explanation purpose. So that approach was suggested by the new archaeologists. Just I'll give you an example. In fact, I will give you the example of the site of Inamgaon. All of you know about the site. This is a very important Chalcolithic site in the Deccan region, close to Pune, and that is site now which was excavated by Deccan College. And I was, as a student, I was trained at this particular excavation. So there, in fact, know that all the different sciences were applied for the interpretation of the data, for the analysis of the data. And ultimately, because of this approach, we were able to reconstruct the social organization of the Chalkoti people there, because we had no evidence about the social organization at all. And lastly, of course, towards the end of my talk, I'm going to tell you how we have done this reconstruction of the social organization of the people for which there is no written records. See the mindset of the traditional archaeologist. Traditional archaeologists only always believe that the data that is available is very small, and it is not really enough to talk about the holistic life of any community. Leave apart, maybe reconstruction of the socio-economic organization. They say that it is out of bound. We cannot really dig out the social organization of the ancient society without any written records. But then we know that at most of the archaeological sites the data is very very small, very very scanty. There are only two sites in fact in the world. One is Pompeii. All of you must have heard about this, in Italy, on one side of the Vesuvian Mount, and on the other side of the Vesuvian Mount is Herculean. And both the sites were buried under the volcanic ash that happened in fact in AD 90. So those sites were buried as it is. The entire evidence, entire data was buried as it is. But at most of the other sites, apart from these two sites, at all other sites, we get only that data which was either discarded in the garbage area or lost in the habitation or maybe broken things. We don't really get a lot of data. So we don't have that luxury in fact. On the basis of very scanty data, we had to reconstruct the entire lifestyle of people. So traditional archaeologists said, no, this data is really very small and not enough for the interpretation purpose. But then, the new archaeologists say that, no, 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 this data is quite enough. And we can certainly reconstruct the social organization on the basis of the available data. So that is a difference between thinking. And I will again show how we have done that in fact, how we have reconstructed the life of the people on the basis of data in fact at the site of Inargaon. But then third important approach that I want to suggest is the collection of data, which is very important. I mentioned to you about the archaeological sites. Archaeologists generally, they discover the sites, follow different methods. I can't explain that in one very short period. But the first thing is that we do is discover the sites, and the nature of the site differs from period to period. Rather, we have two broad periods. One is the period prior to the settled life, that is the hunting gathering stage, and which is very long, in fact, from 20 lakhs up to almost 10,000 years. That is a very lengthy period of the hunting gathering stage. So in the hunting gathering stage, people were moving all the time, constantly on the move. So we do not find any formation of the proper sites in that period. We do find traces, and the traces are mostly in fact in the area which is well protected. For example, Bhimbetka in central India. There are a lot of natural caves there. So those caves were occupied by the Stone Age people because the climate during the Stone Age period was very, very, very cold. It was ice age. So sometimes we get the traces of the human activities in caves or the maybe some shelters, natural shelters. But from the period, from the beginning of the settled life, in India it goes back to 9,000 years, 7,000 BC. So from 7,000 BC till almost late medieval period, the nature of site is in the form of mounds, low mounds, low or sometimes high mounds. And these are the mounds, what we call as the habitation mounds, which are formed because of the human activities. People live, in fact, generation after generation, culture after culture at the same spot for thousands of years. And they carry out a lot of activities. Because of their activities, the sites are formed. And then, of course, ultimately, the sites are deserted at some stage because of maybe climate and other factors. And whatever remains up there, of course, when they leave the site, of course, they carry everything. Right? The intact things are being carried by these people, so that they can use where they settle, next spot. So, the data that is available is very, very small. So this data needs to be properly studied, properly collected in proper context. Context is so important. If you do not find the context, the object that is found will remain mute. It will never speak. But the moment you have context, it will start speaking. I will tell you, how that starts speaking. But before that, what are the approaches that we should follow? It is not possible to excavate each and every site, not necessary also, because excavation is a act of destruction also of the site. So we don't want to do that at every site. But without excavation also, we need to get maximum information of the site as much as possible from the ancient site. And that is what we do in fact. So there are two ways, of course. One is that we adopt what is called as the sampling method. Louis Binford, I mentioned about his name. He is the one, in fact, who introduced this very scientific sampling method. And when he introduced, he called this as a random sampling method. So he suggested that, you identify the area of the site that, archaeologists can easily identify on the basis of the nature of the site. Because the color of the site, ancient site is always whitish. And then, you can, grid the entire site, put, 5 meter over 5 meter grid on the site. And the general belief is that the objects which are lying on the surface, they are very close to the original position. They are not really moved much away from their original position. So the objects on the surface reflect what is lying immediately below the surface. So he suggested that you make a grid and collect the data, because on the surface you find a lot of material lying. In fact, it gets exposed, like pottery, for example. Large number of pottery, animal bones are found. Sometimes other objects like beads and bangles are found, and the other traces of any activities. So he suggested that you collect this object and analyze, from each and every grid separately, make a separate record. He said that if there is a, kiln there, maybe pottery kiln, then you are likely to find on the surface maybe the burnt patch, then maybe fragments of pottery in different stages of manufacture. Maybe some is over-fired, some is under-fired, and you also will get, some burnt lumps along with that. So that is the indication of a activity. So you can easily identify different activity areas. Similarly, we have done this exercise at the site of Rakhiuri, and we could identify number of craft manufacturing activities on one of the mounds. Because at Rakhiuri there are 9 mounds, and we were wondering, which activities were carried out on which mound. That was not clear. So we carried out this particular exercise, and we identified, the different activities on different mounds. So by doing this, one can certainly try to understand the different activity areas only by collecting the material from the surface. So Binford did that when he actually to test the hypothesis. He propounded hypothesis, and to test the hypothesis, he carried out the excavation at the same spot. And he found that nearly 60 to 70% of his presumption, which was done on the basis of surface collection, that turned out to be true. And then he suggested that this type of method should be adopted. But what he did, in fact, he called this as random sampling because he said that you need not collect, the material from all the grids. Only 10% of the grids you select, maybe randomly by using the random chart. And therefore, he called this as the random sampling. But here, by doing so, only 10% of the site is represented. And later, in fact, only in maybe 70s, another American scholar, Charles Redman, he was working on the early farming committees in Palestine region, and he wanted to apply this method. But then he realized that this is really random because it really does not cover the entire site. So he suggested that it should be, a systematic sampling. You know, grid the entire site, collect material from all the grids, and analyze. Maybe it will take more time, and but you will get complete idea about the activities carried out at the site. So he called this as systematic sampling, and we did, of course, systematic sampling at Rakhi. So the advantage of this method, one is that you are not excavating the site, so you are not destroying the site. You're keeping it for future. Secondly, you don't need big budget for this. You don't need a big team for this. So that is the advantage. But the disadvantage of this method is that you have to have a properly well preserved site. If the site is well preserved, then this method works very well. If there is a lot of disturbance, maybe a lot of damage on the site, perhaps there it is not useful. And large number of sites in India, they are highly disturbed sites. So we are not really able to use this method at number of sites, but a very important approach for the collection of data and how that data is used for our purpose. So that is one method, in fact, approach suggested. And the other approach that which we have also applied at Rakhigarhi, is the GPR survey, ground penetration radar survey, which is so important. Now we have small, this machine, in fact, which is used for scanning the site, the surface of the site. We just move with the machine on the site, and this machines, sends maybe some signals down. And wherever there is some disturbance, like if there is a structure, stone structure or brick structure, you will get a different signal there. Or if there's a pit, you will get different signal. And this signal goes down up to almost 25 to 30 meters. And most of sites are within that range. In fact, we do not have any site, in fact, which is more than 30 meters high. Rakhigarhi is almost 24 meters. So there, by using this method, you also, again, you can try to find out what is the nature of the data down there. We will not be able to identify function of each and every structure that we detect through this particular method. But certainly, certainly we get some idea about the nature of the data, nature of evidence there. And at Rakhigarhi, we know that the best part of the site, what we call as the citadel part of the site, That is under modern occupation. Nearly 10,000 people are living on that mound. And we know that now at any stage, we will not be able to excavate the site because people are living there and they're owning the land now. So we have decided to use this method there. And by using this method, we will certainly be able to generate a lot of data from the site, a lot of information from the site, which can be used for our purpose, for our research. So, this GPR is so important. In fact, GPR survey is so important. So here, what you have to do in fact, you have to collaborate with number of other institutions which have the specialties. You have to bring in fact specialists from different fields. So that is one approach, a field-based approach that I suggested. And then once you have the data from the site, you find two kinds of nature of data at the ancient sites. One is what we call as artifact. Artifact is defined as anything that was made and used by human being. So that is called artifact. So all the things like the tools, their stone objects, their maybe ornaments, everything that was made, terracotta figurines, that falls under the category of artifacts. And besides that, we also get what we call as the ecofact, the food refuse, maybe animal bones. We also get human skeletal remains. We get botanical remains. So all this is equally important. And in the excavation, in fact, now if you do not understand the context of these finds, both the ecofacts, what I say, and the artifacts, whereas then you will not be able to interpret the data properly. I'll just give you an example. How this method is called the contextual approach or the contextual archaeology. And this is of course the approach which was suggested by new archaeologists, particularly Ian Hodder. So when he introduced, he called as conjunctive approach. Later it was modified as contextual approach. You get a lot of objects in the excavation, and these objects have to be interpreted. We have to find out the function of the objects. So here you have to consider the location of the object, which is very important. Secondly, you have to consider what things are found around that object. What are the other objects? That will include both artifacts and ecofacts. And therefore, we always propose that in the excavation, we should have scientists also working with us. We should have botanists working with us, zoologists working with us, anthropologists working with us at the site. So they can collect the data from the proper context. You get, suppose, a terracotta figurine in the excavation, and you want to find out the exact function of this figurine. You know that figurines are used for two purposes. One is as a toy, maybe made by for children purpose, or even figurines were worshipped also. So how do you find whether it is just a toy or it was a worship object? And here contextual approach is very, very important. First, if it is a simple toy, it will be found in fact in a big hall. Maybe today, it will be found in fact in the drawing room in today's context. So that is one context. The location is one context. Secondly, the other associated, evidence will be some more art objects. If it is simply used as an art object or as a toy, then you find maybe more toys around that, more art objects around that. Sometimes we use terracotta figurines as art object also. So you'll find that, along with that. So if you have this context in a big hall and along with other toys or other other terracotta figurines or other art objects, then you can interpret that as a simple art or the terracotta or the toy. But if it is a worship object, then it will have definite place. Like today, in fact, it will found in a small room maybe, or near the platform or on the platform. So that becomes a very important context. It is found near the maybe small room or platform. So that has a definite function there. And then it will be the associated context will be you might find the remains of flower. The botanists can extract that. You might find the remains of maybe coconut. If you have that context around the object and the location, maybe the place within the structure, then certainly you can interpret that as a worship object. So this is how we use the context. Context is so important. And then we use varieties of different methods, different approaches to generate a lot of information from the ecophytes. The botanists, of course, they have reconstructed the entire history of agriculture. They can talk about the important crops that were grown on the basis of data from the archaeological sites. Then they also can talk about the agriculture system. Similarly, about the zoologists, in fact, they collect bones, they shed some light on the on the food habits of the people, the role of animals in the food, in the trade, and all this. And from the human bones, so much information can be drawn. In fact, this exercise started in fact at the site of Inamgaon. So the bones are treated to chemical analysis. This is called stable isotope or strontium analysis. By doing so, we can find out what is the percentage of maybe zinc and copper in the bone, percentage of manganese and magnesium in the bone, copper in the bone. And from that, you can make some inference about the percentage of different foods in the diet. If the person is eating more maybe plant food, then in the bones, of course, you will find higher percentage of magnesium and magnesium. But if the person is eating maybe more animal food, then his bone will contain more higher percentage of zinc, copper. So from that, we can make out what is the percentage of maybe animal food and maybe plant food in the diet. And that can be revealed, of course, through this type of analysis. So we have to take help of the specialist, use very high tech machines for getting this information. So we have to collaborate with the scientist. Then the anthropologist also can study the cause of the death of the person, how the person has died. Whether he died because of some accident, which can be quite visible impact on his body, or he has died because of some disease. If he has died because of some disease, then they will find maybe some lesions, some lines on the bones, and the lines on the bones occur because of different diseases, and the nature of these lesions differ from disease to disease. So easily, anthropologists can identify what disease the person was suffering from, and how this becomes so important. At the site of Mohenjo-daro, archaeologists discovered number of skeletal remains on top of the site at Mohenjo-daro. They were just lying in the street. and one British archaeologist, Sir Mortimer Wheeler. Now he always believed that the Harappans were Dravidians and they were killed, destroyed by the Aryans coming from outside. So he said that this is the evidence about the Aryans coming to Indian subcontinent and destroying the Harappan civilization. So that was a hypothesis which he did on the basis of what is available. But later these bones were studied by a physical anthropologist, very well-known physical anthropologist from America, Kenneth Kennedy. And he said that these people did not die in any skirmish, battle or any fight. Because if they had died in that fight, then there should have been injury marks on their body, which is not there at all. And then, of course, they he found that perhaps there could be two reasons. One could be that there may be some epidemic because of which people have died, number of people at one and the same time, or they could have died because of suffocation, because most of the skeletal remains were in the flood deposit. So he thought that these people died because of other reasons, not because of the fight. So naturally, the hypothesis which was propounded by Wheeler, based on simple data without analysis, now that hypothesis has been challenged now because of the scientific analysis that was done on the skeletal remains. So this is how it is so useful. Not only we understand the health, the diet, but we also can understand this complex information also, and that can really change the course of history. Wheeler strongly supported the invasion of the Aryans, and this data does not really support. And today, of course, we have the DNA data, of course, which does not support at all. Finally, the DNA research, right now, which rather I began, in fact, at the site of Rakhigarhi, or even before Rakhigarhi, at the site of Farmana, which is close to Rakhigarhi. And I always thought that now, if you really want to understand about the people, because there was some controversy whether the Harappans were local or they came from outside. What sort of relation between the Harappans and the contemporary hunter-gatherers or contemporary farmers? What is the composition of the population during Harappan time? So these questions are very important. And these questions can be answered only by undertaking the genetic studies, the DNA studies. And from the DNA studies, of course, you can certainly find out, that's what we have done, about the ancestry of the people, their relation with the contemporary population. And certainly this data is useful, in fact, for correcting the history. The Aryan invasion theory is debunked now because we do not really find any evidence of that. So this is how the scientific data that we find from the archaeological site is so useful, in fact. So these type of approaches needs to be adopted. Some of you might be studying the subjects in great detail, doing your masters and PhD in the subject. So adopt some of these latest approaches, and then only you'll be able to contribute immensely. Otherwise, following the same set pattern will not really lead you to any remarkable conclusions or discoveries. And lastly, the final, approach that I want to discuss with you: how do we reconstruct the social organization? How we have done that, in fact, at the site of Inamgaon. See, Inamgaon was done, in fact, in 70s and 80s, before even the concepts of new archaeology became popular, in fact, in the West or in America. And here I'm just going to tell you how, if you are so careful about the context and about the nature of the data, you can easily identify, the social organization. You have to use a lot of your common sense. We propounded that the Chalcolithic people at Inamgaon and other places in Deccan region, they had a chiefdom society. On what basis we did that? Firstly, we know that there are certain characteristic features of a chiefdom society. So we identified those characteristic features, and then try to relate the data in fact one by one, whether we have data for this characteristic feature or not. We found, to reconstruct the social organization, you have to of course excavate on one very large scale. You have to have bigger data. And fortunately at Inamga, we have both in fact the architectural data as well as data of their burials also. Because people used to bury the dead body within the habitation also there, the Chalcolithic people. So both the data were available. And how we have used this data for the reconstruction of the social organization at Inamga. So we found that there are the common people build single or double room structures, simple mud structures. But in the center of the settlement, we had one structure which had 5 rooms, different completely, a big, much bigger compared to all the other structures. So here, you can have two hypotheses. Then one is that you can say that maybe this is the house of a very rich person. You can have that hypothesis. Somebody else will say, no, no, this is the house of a very important person, maybe chief of the community. How do you find out that? So your both the hypotheses are correct here, because when you compare, with other structures, you find quite, distinct here. Then we considered the evidence of burials, and that ultimately that led us to believe the status of the person. The common people, in fact, at Inamgaon, they used to bury dead body in a pit, in a sleeping position. And before burying, they used to cut off the feet so that he does not run away and turn into ghost, maybe, possibly. We do not know exactly. But that possibility is very much there. But in this structure, that is the evidence found in all the other structures, single room or double room structures. But in this structure, we found two burials, one of a child and the other one of an adult. The child, in fact, in case of Inamgaon, the children were buried in two pots. They put mouth to mouth, and the dead body was placed inside, and then buried in a pit, along with some other maybe burial goods like pots, ornaments, and tools. But the burial found, in fact, the burial of a child found in this particular structure was completely different. The child was placed in a what we call as a four-legged jar, clay jar, not in two pots. So here the treatment was different here. And this merely does not indicate that the person is rich, but it indicates that perhaps his status is different from the common people. Then we found the burial of an adult, a man. And the man was not placed in a pit like other burials in a sleeping position. He was also kept, he was made to sit, the dead body was made to sit in a four-legged clay jar. And he was buried. And what is interesting, which is very important, the feet of the person were not cut off. And that was the rule, in fact, in the society, that the feet should be cut off before the burial. But in this case, it was not done. That means the normal rules of the community were not applicable to this particular person. And that reflects his status. And therefore, we say that, this is the burial of a chief, not only of a rich person. Chief is a rich, of course. So that is how we could come to the conclusion. And then, of course, we have the associate evidence also. Evidence for the characteristic feature. One of the important characteristic feature is the site hierarchy. You find different categories of the site. We do have that evidence in fact in Chalkodich level. Then the other characteristic feature is the division of labor or the craft specialization. We have found the houses of craftsmen in fact at Namgaon. Then the trade, hinterland trade. We have the evidence. In fact, we have some objects in fact which are coming from Gujarat, some from the coastal part, etc. And the public architecture, because only public architecture are undertaken when there is a chiefdom society, because somebody needs to give order for the construction or for the activities. And here chief can get this work done. So we found, maybe public granary in the village at Inamgaon, in the ancient village. And also there was a fortification wall, which is considered to be one of the important public architecture. Also, we found the evidence of maybe the artificial irrigation system, etc. So this how this entire evidence ultimately, when we analyze, then we came to know that the person had a different status, and then we could identify that we could reconstruct the social organization. So this how this new approaches, and here you as I said you are using a lot of common sense and a lot of data. Finally, this I will say that we do not have enough data from the ancient sites because the nature of the data is so small. But then at the same time, by using common sense, you can do that, and also by using the ethnographic data. In India, of course, fortunately, there are a number of communities living in different stages of period. We are still hunter-gatherers in parts of India, in central India, in Madhya Pradesh, in Bastar area, in Andaman Nicobar. You study this, maybe lifestyle of the people, their hunting strategy, their, maybe organization, and that data can be used for the reconstruction of the maybe life of the hunter-gatherers. Similarly, the farmers in the village, they have not really forgotten 3,000 years old tradition, 4,000 years old tradition. They are being continued. So by studying them, you can easily reconstruct the life of the ancient communities. At Inamgaon, I will just give you the last example. We found number of in the structures, number of circular platforms, mud platforms, and we were not able to identify why these platforms are used, what purpose platforms are used, what could be the function. But one day we were invited to the village for tea, and in the village we could notice that the house had a similar platform, and those platforms were used to support the storage bin, which is made of wicker work. Then immediately stuck to us, and we say that the platforms found in fact in the Chalkodich houses, they were made for supporting the storage bins. So this is how a lot of ethnographic data can be used, a lot of common sense can be used in archaeology. But by so this is a teamwork basically. Archaeology or history reconstruction is a teamwork. So we should not forget about that. Secondly, we need to really, collaborate with specialists from different fields. Then only perhaps you will be able to generate this type of data, and then you achieve your goal. In fact, goal to reconstruct the holistic life of the people, ancient people, and this is how these archaeologists and historians this is the working style of them, and then only perhaps you can use the data for reconstructing the true picture of the ancient period. So your research methodology counts, matters a lot. Your approaches to the data, is very important. How do you take analysis, do the analysis of the data? That is important. And then the interpretation. So if you follow step by step, go step by step, you will achieve. The interpretation can be different, of course. Somebody will have different opinion. That doesn't matter. But you should be firm that this is my data, and this data gives me this type of story, and that should be your approach. And I'm sure that you will succeed by undertaking this type of approach. So I stop here. I take this opportunity to thank Ishan Sharma for organizing this talk and giving me this opportunity to interact with all of you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But you can write to me anytime, and we'll be in touch with each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very informative lecture. And without further ado, I would, just move to the conversation. And the first question really is by a volunteer who is working with Karwan. Her name is Rukmani Banerjee. Her question is, given the recent emphasis on oral and cultural sources of history, how do you think this affects historiography in the Indian context of mass movement archiving, like the anti-Sikh riots of 1984 or the student movements in our recent past? Why are these traditions of source making important to mass movements, if at all?
See, the oral traditions, is very important, of course. In the Indian context, because most of the knowledge system that we generated right from the beginning of civil life till today, that is being passed on from generation to generation through oral tradition.
Yes.
So it has a lot of implications, lot of importance. I was excavating a site in Rajasthan, and there, one day morning, in fact, one person came to our camp, and I just asked, what you do. He said, no, no, nothing. I don't. I'm not educated. But then, he said that, I read the genealogy of the royal family. He was not educated, but he could remember the genealogy for almost 800 years. So there, you can see the importance of that. But then, you know, at regular intervals, the original maybe message that is to be conveyed, that is sometimes maybe corrupted at some stage. So if the original message is not is corrupted, then naturally at some stage you get the wrong signal, wrong maybe message. So because of this, sometimes a lot of misunderstanding happen. So being a historian, in fact, now we should try to ascertain the authenticity of the data that we are using, and we should make clear to everyone that that look, there is no authenticity in this data, so we cannot really rely on the only on the oral approach that we are following. So we have to be really careful about this, and the historians can certainly play a very important role in this respect.
Yes. So this question is from Anusha Nagar, and her question is, how do historians accomplish the desired goal of maintaining neutrality and objectivity while analyzing the sources of histories, considering the fact that they are essentially narrative based on different perceptions which were perhaps ideologically constructed?
Say your history writing should not merely be based on one source. Because that's what I was talking to you. If you are using only one source, it is going to be always biased. For example, let me give the example of the Aryan invasion. Somebody proposed that maybe people came from outside, and they were called Aryans, and then they said that they spread all over the country. They drew away the local population. They killed the local population, and this continued for till today. But we never try to generate enough data, because any hypothesis that we build has to be supported by proper evidence, and only textual evidence is not really enough. And therefore, I was really emphasizing the approach that was propounded by R.S. Sharma, that follow that approach, and that will lead you to the maybe right kind of history, and that will not really distract you from the real fact. So this is very important that we follow this method. Being a historian, first that there are two advantages, that you will certainly neutralize these lot of rumors, in fact. And secondly, you will generate new data which will correct the earlier misconception or misunderstanding about history. So we have to really play a very, very important role in this respect also. Okay.
So this question is from Meghan Chitra. His question is, how far has the current historical writing and interpretation been influenced on the basis of bias and communalism aspect for communal reasons?
See, that happens if the historian is not really serious, if he is not really consulting the right sources, then perhaps he will write wrong history, and that will create a lot of problems. So my emphasis is that you have to be very, because this is a very sensitive issue. So you have to be very 100% sure that the data that you are using is authentic, and you've done your homework properly, you've done your analysis properly, and then only you should be able to publish that. And that will certainly will remove all this misunderstanding, or maybe whatever the wrong messages that are sent. That will of course automatically be neutralized. So we have to be really careful, in fact, again, in this respect. And therefore I chose to speak on this particular topic, that what should be our approach, how do we use the maybe generate proper primary sources, and how do we use maybe scientific aids, in fact, for analyzing this data. You have to synthesize the actual data that you have with the analysis of the data that you have done, and then only perhaps you will be able to reach to the proper conclusion. So that is very important, that you need to learn fact, that you are in the initial stage of your career. So try to follow this authenticated method that that are being applied in different parts of the world, and then perhaps you'll be able to really contribute. And don't get distracted if somebody is maybe criticizing you. They will criticize you only because you are doing some good work. That always happens. Don't be get maybe deviated from what is happening. So keep producing some good work, and the data that you produce should be in the in the public domain, so that anybody can check that data that you are using. And I'm sure that nobody will have any suspicion about your maybe intention. So you have to make your intent very clear, that this is what I am doing, this is my approach. Okay.
Yes, sir. This will be the last question. This is a point that Gurdas Dhawal ji is making, that really regional history is sometimes overlooked. So going forward, it would be good to study local histories than the pan-Indian. So do you, sir, believe that our history is basically based on the pan-Indian approach and not the local histories?
No, I fully agree with him, in fact, because in India, generally, we do not really give a lot of emphasis on the regional history. And if you want to reconstruct the pan history of the country, you have to develop the regional history, in all the parts of the country, and then only, you'll be able to generate the, history of the entire country. So this is very important. This is also very important approach that we need to follow in future. That in each region, of course, now you have maybe different, maybe cultural elements, different traditions. So identify them, reconstruct them properly, and then you can use the data for, in the history of the country. So this is really important that we need to look into this matter, and both the historians and archaeologists, they need to focus on the regional history. They need to focus on the history of the common people also in respective regions. So this is really important. Yes.
So thank you very much, sir, for this lecture and for taking out time from a busy schedule of many more lectures that is scheduled. Thank you very much.
No, it's a pleasure, in fact, Ishan, and really, I'm so happy that people like you are there, in fact, now who I'm sure that the future of the subject is bright, because people like you, need to carry forward, uh, the good work that some of us have begun, in fact. So this is how we have to really work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
everyone who joined us live this evening. And the recording of this lecture will be available on our YouTube channel, so don't forget to subscribe to it. Thank you very
Sure,
much.
sure. You forward that to me, the link forward to me.
Sure, sir.
Yeah. So all the best, Ishan, and to